Hey guys, in this video I'm going to be talking about the different set bonuses that are now available with Nax coming out and what the best setup is going to be for Hemo, for daggers, and for even cold blood daggers. So obviously we now have tier 3 coming into the game. Bone Scythe armor is really good. Not only does it have a very powerful 4 set bonus, but individually speaking, all of the items are going to be very, very powerful. Every single piece is best in slot for PvP except for the belt, which is slightly worse than Never Ending Agony. So anytime you're not considering set bonuses, your default is always going to be tier 3. And when we do look to set bonuses like Death Dealer or Night Slayer, we need to make sure the set bonus is actually going to make up for the loss in stats, because obviously you're going to have the best stats from the gear from Nax. So there's a couple different configurations we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at full tier 3 using Belt of Never Ending Agony. This is basically going to be the set of gear that is just going to give you the best stats while maintaining the 4 set for Bone Scythe. We're going to be looking at the Death Dealer set with the 4 set Bone Scythe. So using all 5 pieces of Death Dealer and swapping the belt from Never Ending Agony to Bone Scythe to maintain the 4 set bonus. We're also going to be looking at Night Slayer, and Night Slayer is going to use a little different setup. It's going to be using the Night Slayer pieces of gear that have the least impact. Going to be using the bracers, the shoulders, the belt, the gloves, and the boots. And the reason for that is the leg, chest, and head offer too many stats, and you end up losing too much by swapping those out. Now, keep in mind, as we're talking about these different configurations, that full tier 3 is always going to have the bonus value that it is going to be the most flexible. What I mean by that is sometimes in PvP, you want to swap out your helmet for a rocket helm, for a mind control cap, even for cat's eye goggles. Also, you can find yourself swapping out your belt for Spider's belt. You can swap out your boots for rocket boots or for stealth skill boots. There's 2 pairs, Dark Mantle, and there's a new pair coming in Nax. So you can see there's a few items that you might want to swap out at different points in time. And tier 3 is going to be the only set that doesn't have drastic consequences for that. If you're going to try and use Night Slayer or Death Dealer, you're going to have a lot of trouble maintaining those sets while swapping out pieces of gear. So even if you do end up using a combination of Tier 3 and Death Dealer, I would recommend having an add-on that helps you swap gear quickly, and I'd recommend swapping over to full tier 3 before you put on a rocket helm or before you put on rocket boots, because you end up losing too much damage, especially as dagger if you break the tier 3 set bonus, and you especially are going to lose obviously a ton of damage if you're downgrading your gear to Death Dealer and then you break the Death Dealer set bonus. So hopefully that makes sense, that no matter what set you end up going with, if you're going to swap gear out, tier 3 is going to make that easiest, the least maintenance, and at the very least, you should be ready to switch into full tier 3 if you're going to swap gear once you have the gear. Obviously, you're not going to have it right away. With that said, let us go into the different sets and what they offer. So obviously, when we're talking about the value of the set bonuses, I have run some example duels through my simulator to give us some approximation of the damage, but it's just really important to understand what the set is doing so you can decide for yourself when it's not going to be good. So for example, the Death Dealer set obviously increases the damage of your Eviscerate. It's important to note that everything besides Eviscerate will get worse because you're downgrading your gear. Your auto attacks will do less damage, Hemo will do less damage, just your Rupture will do less damage. Everything will be worse. You'll have even a little bit less stamina. The only thing you gain is the Eviscerate damage, and then I guess the Evasion set bonus too. But the point is, if you can then think of how you were going to be fighting different opponents. So let's say against a warrior, you duel a warrior 10 times in a row, and you notice that you haven't pressed Eviscerate yet. Maybe it's time to take off Death Dealer, right? And maybe you decide you're never going to use Death Dealer against a warrior if how you're playing it, you're not pressing Eviscerate. Likewise, when we come over to Night Slayer, you're losing a tremendous amount of damage just to increase your energy by 10. So it is very important at the end of the fight, you do not have 10 energy left over. It's very important that at no point during the fight, like you didn't have a window in which the 10 energy was really high impact. If that's not the case, you shouldn't be using the gear. You should be dipping very low on energy and proving the value of the set. So for example, if you're playing daggers, if you cheap shot, backstab, gouge, that's an example where your energy is going to go very low. You're going to go down to 5 energy. That's actually meaning the set is doing something, right? The 10 energy was the difference between you being able to backstab and having to Sinister Strike. If you're not actually seeing tangible changes in your rotation because of Night Slayer, you're just going to lose damage. So there are some cases, and you're going to see that in The Sims, where the Night Slayer armor can be pretty spiky in terms of how good it is. And that is because if you are not using the energy, it's really bad. If you are using the energy, it's very good. So just keep in mind that while I'm going to be giving you numbers on like how good the different sets perform in a simulated duel, think of how you're playing the game. Think of the matchups that are important for you to win, and really think of how the set bonuses are going to interact. Another example I can give is if you were playing daggers and you're going around in battlegrounds, ambushing people, backstabbing people, obviously neither set bonus is really going to do anything, right? Ambush plus backstab isn't affected by Night Slayer 5 set, and ambush plus backstab is not affected by Death Dealer. So if you are playing in BGs and you're ambushing and backstabbing a lot, full tier 3 is going to be the best. That's not necessarily going to be reflected in the duel simulations because the duel simulations aren't showing ambush, right? As soon as you don't stun the enemy, a lot of unexpected variables can arise. So that's not as easy to simulate. But just that's the first thing I want to mention is understand what the set bonuses do, because you yourself can know when the set bonus is actually going to have value and how it might change depending on the matchup you're facing. Now, with that said, I've kind of previewed the different pieces of gear we're going to use, just so you guys get an idea. Full tier 3 is about 100 attack power worth of stats better than Death Dealer, and Death Dealer is about 100 attack power better than Night Slayer, meaning it's 200 attack power worse than tier 3 in terms of stats, so it has to make up for that with the set bonus. But with all that said, let's move on to the Sims. Now, again, both of these pages I'm talking about are going to be in the description below. I'm not going to go too in detail of the Sims. I just wanted to explain what we're looking at in case you wanted to look at them as well. Essentially, I have Hemo, I have Dagger, and I have Cold Blood Dagger simulated duels. The rules of the duel are obviously you're going to keep the target stunned or blinded or gouged at all times. As soon as CC ends, the duel ends. So it's just like an opener simulation. Now, all of this is damage, not counting armor, and these are the criteria of each of the duels. So for example, in this first duel, cheap shot is able to be used, kidney can be used, blind will be used, and both cold blood and Renataki are going to be used. There's also going to be examples where, for example, let's say Renataki was on cooldown, or maybe blind was on cooldown, maybe both were on cooldown, and then also examples where blind is on cooldown and you don't have access to that. So that basically is the example of all 12 cases that I'm showing here, all the way down to where, let's say you have cheap shot, you don't have time to kidney shot, and you have no cold blood or Renataki available. So that's how you read the sim. I'll leave it up to you guys to go through each of the cases if you wish. I might flip back to this page as I'm going through the conclusions, but to just keep this video brief, I'm going to go over to the conclusions of my analysis of the Sims, but check the description if you'd like to see them for yourself. Let's start with Hemo and what gear is going to be best. So overall, Tier 3 plus Death Dealer is going to be the best for dueling. The reason is because while Tier 3 can pull ahead of it, like full Tier 3 can pull ahead in longer fights, and by longer, I mean when you have blind, when you're cheap shotting and kidney shotting twice, it kind of dilutes your eviscerate damage. In those longer fights, Tier 3 can slightly pull ahead, but Death Dealer plus Tier 3 can keep up with the full set, pretty nicely. And then when the fight gets really short, it's amazing, right? Tier 3 plus Death Dealer is really strong in those situations where most of your damage is coming from Eviscerate. And so that's why I would say overall, based on the Sims, Tier 3 plus Death Dealer is going to be the best set. Now, again, keep in mind the factors I talked about before we started, that it has the least flexibility to use rocket helm, boots, spider belt, everything like that. But just going off of dual damage, Tier 3 plus Death Dealer is going to be the best. I did want to make a mention about, and also I want to mention Tier 3 is strong as well and close to Death Dealer, but falls a little behind in shorter fights where you're cheap shotting, hemoing a couple times, and going for an Eviscerate. Those are going to be situations where Death Dealer is going to pull ahead. So in that opener of cheap shot hemo becomes possible because of the Tier 3 4-set bonus. You can cheap shot hemo, and if you get a crit, you're able to Eviscerate. Now, if you do not have Renataki on cooldown, Night Slayer actually is very good in the shorter fights. And across the board, Night Slayer is actually fairly decent if you don't have Renataki up. Now, when you have the Renataki cooldown available, unfortunately, a lot of times the energy from Night Slayer is just wasted. But if you do not have the trinket Renataki Charm of Trickery, you should get it. But if you don't have it, or if it's on cooldown, Night Slayer is actually very good, in most cases the best. So if you were in a world with no Renataki, Night Slayer would actually be a viable option as the armor you use. Next, let's move on to daggers. Now, this is going to be without Cold Blood. I'll do Cold Blood daggers separately. So this is going to be either deep sub daggers or a dagger spec that uses improved sprint. Now, overall, Night Slayer is the best. The reason I say this, again, we're talking about duels right now. Like I mentioned before, if you were to go do Battlegrounds and ambush a bunch of people, full Tier 3 is the best. But Night Slayer is going to be the best because of how it interacts with Gouge. You can cheap shot, backstab, and Gouge. Now, you also can get that opportunity to do that with Tier 3. The problem is, if you don't have Renataki up, it's a little risky. If you cheap shot and backstab and Tier 3 4-set does not proc, you do not have enough energy to Gouge, and you're in a little bit of an awkward situation because, well, you're just going to lose a lot of damage because you don't have a Gouge in your opener. So that's the reason why Night Slayer is still the best overall. Tier 3, again, it gives you the flexibility to swap gear. It's very close, and it's going to increase your damage if you are ambushing regularly. But Night Slayer would be my recommendation for a dagger spec that is not taking Cold Blood. I also want to mention, I think this is obvious, but yeah, don't really use Death Dealer if you're not going to play Cold Blood Dagger. I think that's fairly well known that Death Dealer is not the greatest with daggers because you're not able to eviscerate as much. However, randomly, I'll just throw it out there. If for whatever reason you do not have time to kidney shot, Death Dealer turns out being the best. Night Slayer actually doesn't really affect a fight that short where you have with the reduced cheap shot cost from going deeper into sub. So believe it or not, Tier 3 plus Death Dealer is the best if you can't kidney shot. But I will say that that's not really relevant because 99% of the time you're going to be planning to kidney shot as a dagger spec without Cold Blood. If you were planning to regularly try and burst really hard in a cheap shot without pressing kidney shot, you should just play Cold Blood daggers, as it can cheap shot, backstab, Renataki, backstab, and then Cold Blood Abyss. That will be your better spec if you valued that. So lastly, let's go to Cold Blood daggers. Cold Blood daggers is all about, big, quick burst. So I was a little torn on how to rank this one because Tier 3 was actually, full Tier 3 was the best on paper. It performed the best across all the different duels that I had set up. However, it doesn't really make sense to rate it in that way because the whole point of playing Cold Blood daggers is to kill someone in a cheap shot. That's the only reason you really play Cold Blood daggers. You don't really gain a lot of damage in a long extended fight. In some cases, just a dagger spec that has reduced cheap shot cost is actually going to do more damage in a lot of cases. So if you're going to play cold blood daggers, you're pretty much in it for the burst. You're pressing cheap shot. You're doing as much damage as possible. You're cold blood BiS. That is this point of the spec. And if you are going to play that spec, I think you should be playing tier 1 and in Death Dealer, one of the two. I think tier 3, while it looks decent, is playing to the weakness of the spec. And if you did want to play tier 3, you might as well just play regular daggers. Now, when it comes to cold blood daggers, tier 1 and Death Dealer are by far the best in the short fights in the Sims. And that is, again, the strength of this spec, the purpose of this spec. I would recommend going tier 1 if you want consistency, because tier 1 is going to allow you to cheap shot, backstab, Renataki, backstab, cold blood BiS 100% of the time. Where Death Dealer, if you try and cheap shot, backstab, Renataki, backstab, you need to get a proc of the tier 3/4 set, or else you cannot afford the eviscerate. So Death Dealer is kind of introduces a little bit of risk, but you'll be hitting harder. I think the Death Dealer set's probably more fun because you're getting these huge eviscerates. You'll have the potential to do more damage than Night Slayer, but Night Slayer is going to add more consistency. So it's ultimately up to you on that one, what you want to go for. I think both are going to be good. If you go and look at the specific fights, you're going to notice that there are some situations where Night Slayer is just way better. So if you have no cooldowns up and you're trying to kill someone in a cheap shot, Night Slayer is way better than everything else just because that 10 energy lets you squeeze in an extra ability. But there's also situations where Night Slayer doesn't really do anything, right? If you're cheap shotting and kidney shotting and you don't have cold blood or Renataki, Night Slayer falls behind. Night Slayer falls behind if you cheap shot kidney Renataki. So there's certain situations where if you don't use that 10 energy from Night Slayer, it just falls flat. So it's got its highs, it's got its lows. You can see here, Night Slayer is like crazily better than anything else. 700 damage better than the second best option because it lets you squeeze in an extra ability. So I'd recommend you guys look at the Sims. Those are my conclusions. Again, for Hemo, I'd recommend tier 3 plus Death Dealer if you're just all out dueling. If you're swapping out gear all the time, go for tier 3 to make your life easier. You could try and be really on top of things, swapping out gear while maintaining the sets, but I think it'll be pretty tough to do. You can use Night Slayer as you're gearing it up, but it's generally not going to be very good if you have your Renataki up. For Dagger, I'd recommend Night Slayer, although tier 3 is going to be very close and also better if you're ambushing people, and again, better if you're swapping out gear. Tier 3 Death Dealer would not recommend for a normal Dagger build. And then finally, for Cold Blood Daggers, I would recommend going for Death Dealer if you want the high highs, and tier 1 if you want consistency in the openers. But that's pretty much it, guys. Again, the links are going to be in the description below. Feel free to ask any questions about the Sims or about the different gear. Remember that this was talking about the damage provided by the sets, not the survivability. So keep in mind that some of the sets are going to have more agility than others. You're going to see that the tier 3 Death Dealer has the most agility. You're going to get the most dodge if dodge is something you care about. Tier 3 Night Slayer is going to have the second most dodge, and full tier 3 actually has the least amount of dodge. In terms of stamina, tier 3 has the most. Tier 3 plus Death Dealer, you lose 40 HP for stamina, and you lose from the original tier 3, you lose 7 stamina with Night Slayer. So not huge differences in survivability. At most, you lose 70 HP going to Night Slayer, which is not a tremendous amount. So I would focus mainly on the damage and how they play. But once again, examine how you play your character. Examine how the different matchups you face and come to a conclusion on what set is going to be best for you.